Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. By August of 1879, the sun felt like a hammer, and Dry Creek was the anvil. The little wash that gave the place its hopeful name had not run since spring. It lay sallow and cracked, a scar twisting away toward the blue teeth of the Oregon mountains. Calves bawled in thin voices. Grass went to thistle, then to nothing. When Elias Boone crossed the yard at noon, his boot heels raised little ghosts of dust that drifted into the kitchen and settled on the table where Ruth kept the ledger of what was left. 2 barrels and a half of rainwater, a crock for coffee, the last jar of pickled peaches from the year before. Boil tonight's water at day's end, she told him, not looking up. It'll lose less to the air. He nodded. They had come to the kind of marriage where every word carried weight, because there were so few to spare. His hat brim cut a dark line across his brow. His hands were those of a man who owned 30 head of cattle, and for the first time, doubted he could save even half. Silas says he'll sell, Ruth added. Silas says a lot, Elias answered. But he saw in her eyes that the name meant something to her, meant the choice that hovered over them, oath like a buzzard. Silas McGraw's spread lay 2 miles north. He'd loaded his wagons at dawn and rolled toward Nicaea with the last of his stock and a look on his face like a door shutting. Elias stepped outside before his throat could betray him. The sky had the hard clarity of enamel. Far off, a dust. Devil stepped sideways across the flats, thin as a thread. He went to the trough, ran a hand inside the dry lip, and came away with grit. The cattle in the far corral raised their heads, hopeful, then lowered them again. Water, he said aloud, as if to conjure it. All we need is water. He had dug 3 test holes already, shallow mouths ringed with rock. The rod from town that forked Willow the storekeeper swore could sniff water like a hound, and swung and then gone still. A trick of his wrists. He had even tried the place the vaqueros talked about, the low swale where a cottonwood stood, like a solemn judge. When he chopped into the ground there, sweating, listening to the metal thock of his spade, he found nothing but powdered earth, the color of rust. The mesa to the west rose like a table someone had forgotten to clear. It was bad country, said the old men at the cantina. Hollow, queer. You could shout your name up there and hear it come back wrong. Once, years back, a survey crew had set camp near its edge, and in the morning the mules were gone, the hobbles, neatly cut. Elias had always kept his grazing to the east, where the sage grew honest, and the ground underfoot felt like ground dot by afternoon. A heat shimmer rode the yard. Ruth brought him a cup of coffee, brewed so thin he could see the porcelain through it. Preacher's coming Sunday, she said. He aimed to ask after you. If he's bringing rain, I'll give him the whole evening, Elias said, and Ruth allowed herself the smallest smile. He envied her that the way she could turn countenance into rationed kindness and make it last dot after she went inside. He loaded the sled with boards, a coil of rope, a pick, his spade, and the iron auger. He'd traded a saddle for the winter they moved out from Missouri. He buckled the lantern to the sled and set off toward the mesa at a deliberate pace, more to fight the hopelessness in his chest than because he believed there was a blessing out there. The cattle followed a little way, black shapes worrying. The fence then drifted back to what shadow the fence posts made. Up on the mesa, the wind was steady but strange thin and cool, as if it were the exhale of a mouth down in the earth. The ground sounded different under his boots, too, drumskin taut. Elias circled until he found a stretch where the soil went from gravel to a finer ash. The sage grew lower here, and there were stones in a ring that looked placed rather than thrown. He drew off his gloves and crouched, pressing his palm to the dirt. Warm, but not hot. He felt nothing but heat and the tremor of his pulse. You're a fool, he told himself, and then just to spite the voice. He set the spade. He dug long. After the sweat turned the dust on his forearms to mud, he dug until his shoulders burned and his legs trembled. He shored the circle with a corbel of boards, one upon another, the way he'd learned from a man in Abilene who dug privy pits you could drive a wagon into and never see the sides slump. He set a stake and knotted rope to it, and eased himself down into a throat of dirt that smelled of sun-baked rock and something cooler below. In memory of water, dot by sundown, he was 6 feet into the earth. The light went gold at the mouth of the shaft and then bruised as purple crept in. He climbed out, set the lantern, and struck a match against his thumbnail. The flame flowered, settled. He lowered it into the dark and saw his sweat shine on. The rough wall, the raw circles where his spade had bitten. Ruth's shadow preceded her. She came with a pail and the small loaf she'd baked with coarse flour and a miser's fist of lard. "You'll break yourself," she said, but her voice held no reproach, only the careful evenness of someone walking a narrow ridge. She handed him the bread. On the pail's lid she'd carved a cross with a pin. "What for?" he asked, half smiling. "It calms me," she said simply. They ate sitting on the sled. The lantern made their faces look like masks. Somewhere far off, a coyote broke into a laugh. When Ruth reached for his hand, her fingers were cold. "If there's nothing down there," she said, "if there's truly nothing, we can drive to Mezia. I'll sew for the army wives." "You could what?" he asked, too quickly. His pride flared and then went out, and he hated that he'd singed her with it. "Sorry." He rubbed his eyes. "I'll go down. A bit more, then I'll come in." Ruth stood and brushed crumbs from her skirt. "All right," she said, and in that one word he heard both faith and its limit. She kissed his temple a dry, brief press and walked back, the lantern's glow following her until it didn't. The night thickened. The mesa took on its own light, a pallor from the stars. Elias went down the rope hand over hand, feet braced to the boards, lantern clenched in his teeth. At 8 feet, the wall changed. The packed soil gave way to something friable, like the crumble of old mortar. He set the lantern on a shelf he'd cut, took the pick, and swung. The iron rang, not on rock, not on mere compact clay, but on something with an edge to it. He beat at it until his breath came in little bites. The pick's tip skittered and struck again, and a sheet gave way. Elias found himself staring at a plane of fitted stone-cut blocks, coursed and mortared, the kind he'd seen once in Santa Fe, in a church whose roof smelled of incense and candle smoke. Only this was buried, and each stone bore a shallow groove. That, in the lantern's trembling light, reminded him of ribs. He reached to touch it, then pulled his hand back, his own superstition rearing its head too late to be of any use. Down here, with the lantern flame making shadows scurry like small animals, men believed whatever their fathers had scoffed at. He leaned closer, squinting. The grooves ran in spirals and jagged strokes, a language to which his eyes had no schooling. Behind, the fitted stones lay some distance, some hollowness. Elias tapped with his knuckles. A sounding came back, resonant as a barrel. He set the pick, narrowed his aim, and chipped along a mortar seam. It crumbled with surprising ease. The stone shifted, as if relieved. Dust rolled over him, and he coughed hard. The fit taking him long enough, he felt a moment's childish panic and imagined the dirt above him choosing that breath to fall. When the air cleared, he saw that the stone had slipped inward a finger's breadth. He levered with the spade, cursed softly as the iron flexed, and then the block fell away, slid forward, and tipped into darkness so absolute it seemed to have texture. A breath of cool air rose into his face. It smelled of mineral damp and a sweetness he could not place, like wet sage. The lantern's flame pulled toward the hole. a little hungry tongue. He widened the opening cautiously, setting aside the cut stones in a neat pile, without quite knowing why he honored their order. Beyond, the lantern showed him a void, and after a moment, a shape that resolved as steps narrow, descending, worn concave by feet that could not have been his or any white man's or any he'd known. The edge of each tread bore a shine like bone polished by a hand. Elias crouched, gripping the lantern so tight the wire bit his palm. He counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3 steps visible before the dark closed its fist. He said out loud, because the sound of his voice seemed to prove he still had a place in the world. "It's a stair. Down in the hollow something," answered Dot. It was not words at first. It was the certainty, in his bones more than in his ears, that the earth was not empty. He had felt such a thing once as a boy, in a cave by the Missouri, lying flat in the dark with a friend gone silent, and an underground stream passing somewhere near, not seen, but sensed through stone as cool as a church floor. This felt like that, magnified an awareness of a weight below, and something in that weight paying attention. He stayed very still. Sweat slid from his hairline and stung his eyes. A minute went, or an hour. The lantern made it hard to tell. At last he swore quietly, almost apologetic, and scrambled up the rope to the mouth where the stars looked oddly far. He stood at the shaft, breathing like a runner, and searched the plain. The ranch lay black and spare, Ruth a shape of sleep behind thin muslin. The cattle were bedded, tails ticking lazily at fleas. All this ordinary life gladdened him so much. He could have shouted, but he bit his tongue. The mesa's wind combed the low brush, and in that combing he fancied he heard a thread of sound, almost like voices layered and far. He told himself it was the wind. He told himself a lot. In the morning he hitched the mule to the sled and drove to town, not because he meant to ask anyone's blessing, but because he needed oil for the lantern and a fresh coil of rope. Dry Creek was 2 streets and a livery, a smithy, a whitewashed chapel the size of a boxcar, an Analuyan store where flour lived in barrels and nails by the pound and chickens, regarding everything with suspicion. The men on the porch made a space for him that was not quite a welcome. "You hear McGraw pulled out?" someone asked. "I did," Elias said, tying the mule to a post. He lifted the lantern and set it on the board planking as if to prove some. Part of his errand was plain. "You look like you wrestled the devil and lost," said the blacksmith, grinning, and the others chuckled. Elias smiled, because that was what this sort of sentence required. Inside the store, it was 10 degrees cooler. Ana wrapped twine around a packet of coffee, so carefully it seemed a prayer. "You going to leave too?" she asked without looking. No," he said, "not yet." She nodded as if she had expected that, as if she knew the stubbornness of men by pound and measure. As he paid, a thin boy with a shock of hair like broom straw sidled up with a poundful of trinkets tarnished. Buttons, a coin, a small silver cross. "Found by the arroyo," the boy whispered, as if it made them sacred somehow. "Keep off bad eyes." Elias hesitated, then bought the cross for 2 cents and put it in his pocket, ashamed of himself and not knowing why. Outside, the men on the porch sat quiet now, looking west. A line of dust smudged the horizon, wagons too far to see the teams. "You'll be lonely out there," the blacksmith said. "I've been lonely before," Elias said. He touched the lip of his hat to no one in particular and drove back toward the mesa, the mule's ears flicking like metronomes. Heat rose and fell like waves. By the time he reached the shaft, his shirt was pasted to his back, and the oil in the lantern had warmed to the smell of fish. He tied the new rope in a fisherman's knot to the old, checked it twice, lashed it to the stake, and set the lantern on a rock, and then after a short prayer, that felt awkward in his mouth, and not long enough by half. He went down again. The opening he had made in the fitted stones looked more precise in daylight. Below it, the steps waited, indifferent to whether he chose to use them. He knelt and held the lantern into the gap. The light crawled down 3 treads and pooled where the 4th began, then stopped. It showed walls on either side, stone smoothed to a polish that made him think of river rock. It showed the first hint of a carving one of those spirals, like a coiled snake or the whorl of a horn cut so shallow a blind man might miss it with his fingers. He tested the edge with his boot, not stepping, just letting the sole feel the thing, solid. The air from below stroked his wrist hair in a cool draft. He drew back, though every part of him leaned forward. Later, he said aloud, we shore the mouth, we make it safe. Later. He set to it with a will, building braces, wedging boards across, driving pegs. He had lost a neighbor once to a well that narrowed at the top and bellied out below and collapsed when a mule leaned her weight to sniff at the inner darkness. He would not die like that, bled into the dirt like so much spilled molasses. Sweat ran into his ears. A hornet came down, circled the lantern, and left. Twice he paused and listened, because he was sure he heard something, no, not heard. Felt. The way a man feels thunder through the soles of his feet when the storm is still beyond the ridge. He told himself it was the creak of wood, the sigh of settling dirt near noon. Ruth's voice came down the shaft, mild as always, and he jumped, hard enough to bark his knuckles on stone. Lunch, she called. You eat it with me this time, not after. He climbed and ate in the shade of the sled-cold beans, a heel of bread, apple slices she'd cored for him with care, while she talked about the small matters she hoarded. To make life appear orderly. A hen gone broody on a knot of nails in the barn, the preacher's wife begging for kerosene she didn't have. He told her about town, but not about the steps. He had an impulse to, an ache along the ribs, as if a confession wanted out, but he kept it. Not because he thought she would stop him, but because saying it would make it a thing alive between them, and he was not ready for that life. When do? You come in? She asked. When the sun goes, he said. I'll be done for the day then. You said that yesterday, she answered, and he almost laughed at the idea of himself, a man who could bargain with the sun. When she went, he touched the silver cross in his pocket, and then, annoyed with himself for the gesture, he took it out and hung it on a nail near the rope. The small charm looked out of place here among his tools, but less so than it had in his pocket with his money and the stump of his pencil. He widened the mouth of the breach by another stone's width, enough that he could kneel properly, and reach past, feeling the coolness coming up from below wrap his forearm like water. In that coolness there was a murmur, and he could no longer pretend it belonged to wood or rope or his own breath. It was delicate as the first sound the kettle makes before it boils. It rose and fell without rhythm, like distant talk at a harvest picnic, where you can't yet pick out the words. He stayed there a long time, listening, his head canted like a hound's. He thought of old stories the soldiers told around a winter. Fire the bluecoat who swore he'd slept on the ramparts of a Spanish ruin and heard chanting rise from the stones. The drummer boy who said the ground at Shiloh hummed for a week. He thought of the vaquero who refused point-blank to camp on the mesa edge because, as he put it, La Tierra canta, the earth sings, and though the man had smiled when he said it, his eyes hadn't. Toward evening, a veil of cloud gathered over the mountains. Lightning stitched a line between 2 peaks and blinked out. The smell that ran ahead of rain came across the plain and then faltered, ashamed, the way small mercies sometimes do. Elias stood, stretched until his back cracked, and wiped his hands on his trousers. He lowered the lantern once more through the opening and held it as far as his arm would allow. The light quivered. Somewhere below, A faint response seemed to shiver back one note, then another, so faint he could have imagined it, so real it set every hair on his arms to standing. He clipped the lantern to the rope, climbed out of the pit, and stood a long time at its rim. The wind off the mesa braided itself through the sage. He worked his jaw and spit into the dirt and watched the spot dry in a heartbeat. The world looked ordinary, honest, hard. The steps below were none of those things. He set boards across the mouth and weighted them with stones, not from fear of animals, but to make it feel if only for a night like a thing shut. He picked up the lantern and the pail and the cross-eyed shovel and started back toward the rectangle of their house. Ruth had lit a lamp. It showed through the window paper, like a coin held to the sun. He did not tell her about the stair. He told her about Silas's wagons instead, and about the boy with the trinkets, and about the blacksmith saying he'd fought the devil and lost. And she smiled and shook her head and ladled him stew made thin with water they could not spare. In the middle of the night he woke and lay with his eyes open and his hand on the edge of the mattress, listening. At first he heard only the wind. Then, on the tail of it, barely there, he thought he heard a sibilance, as if someone had spoken his name from the mouth of a long hallway. He told himself again it was the wind. He counted his breaths. He slept at dawn. He laced his boots while the sky still held the last white of stars. He drank coffee without tasting it and kissed Ruth's forehead where a stray hair had drawn a pale line. The cattle lowed, impatient, and somewhere a quail whistled its lonely call. He took the lantern and the rope and a new courage that felt too much like dread and walked toward the mesa that had once been wind and stone and would now have to be faced, step by step, as if it were a problem he meant to solve with his hands. He did not know, as a man never knows at the beginning, what the end of such walking would be. He only knew that the earth had answered him when his spade called, and that the answer had not been water alone. Elias was at the shaft before first light, when the stars still had a cold brightness, and the ground held the night's small mercy in its skin. He moved the stones off the boards he'd laid across the mouth, levered the planks aside, and felt the draft climb his forearms, as if the hole itself were breathing. Ruth came after him with a mug of coffee and a towel across her shoulder. She peered into the darkness, careful not to lean too far. "You going to shore first?" "I am," he said. "Then I'm going to see where it goes." She didn't start at that. She just set the mug on a flat rock and worked the towel between. Her hands like a rope she meant to soften. "The preacher sent word," she said. "He'll make his loop Sunday for sure. He's bringing hymnals." "Hymnals won't hold water," Elias said, and immediately regretted the shape of the words. "I'm sorry." He touched the towel. "I'll be careful." "That's not the same thing as being safe," she said, but there was no stopping him, and both of them knew it. She kissed the corner of his mouth habit more than heat and went back toward the house, the line of her shoulders square, tied the new rope to the stake again, and paid it out, arm over arm. He had been up half the night making up his mind and assembling the kind of logic a man needs when he means to do a foolish thing. He put chalk in his pocket from the barn blackboard, a thin spool of twine, the small notebook he used for cattle tallies, and a carpenter's pencil. He checked the lantern twice, and then again. He looped the twine around his wrist, tied its leading end to the stake, and cinched it until it bit. He dropped into the shaft by the boards he had set as ladders, and when he reached the breech those careful, fitted stones now missing a block to make a low mouth, he stopped and listened. The air from within was cool and wet-lipped, and with it there rode a sound he could not name, like the hush between waves, though he had not seen the sea in 20 years. He worked a breath in and out, pinched the lantern flame back to a steady heart, and crawled through with his shoulders and hips turned sideways to fit, Inside, the world changed scale. The lantern made a small circle around him, and everything beyond it became suggestion. The stair began immediately, cut into the stone itself, each tread worn in the center. The walls at shoulder height were slick with a polish that did not feel like hands. It felt like time. He took the chalk from his pocket and drew a short line on the first step, a longer one on the second, 3 on the third, so that if he had to retreat blind, he could count by touch. He tied the twine at his waist and let it spool. He put his left hand against the wall and promised himself he would keep it there, no matter what came. The steps fell away at a steady pitch. He found a rhythm lantern forward, boot down, hand on stone, and kept his breath even because men in tight places only get hurt when panic speeds them up. After 15 treads, he passed the first carving. It was little more than a shallow groove to his fingers. But when the lantern caught it just so, it made a spiral, not the neat kind a schoolgirl draws, but a spiral that kinked and broke back on itself, as if it had fought the hand that cut it. He touched it and felt a grit come away, smelled a scent like flint struck out 30 treads, 40. The air cooled further and grew thicker in his nose, sweet with something that might have been damp sage or a flower he could not remember. The sound he had named a hush grew distinct and separate from his own life's noises. It was in the stone rather than in the air, and his hand on the wall told his bones what his ears could not. He reached a landing, narrow and half-mooned. One side, niches were set into the wall, 6 of them, at shoulder height, no two the same size. In the first niche, dust lay thick as felt and kept the shape of a bowl long gone. In the second, he found pebbles arranged in a triangle. The third held a shard of obsidian that flashed at the lantern like an eye. He did not touch that one. In the 6th and smallest, someone long ago had pressed a scrap of something fibrous into the mortar, and though it had petrified to the hardness of shell, it still suggested the bend of a reed or a stalk. Something about the regularity, the arrangement, the care sobers a man more than any number of skulls would have done. Elias bowed without meaning to, the way a body bends in a church. Even if the mind has not consented dot below the landing, the stair steepened. He chalked his lines. He counted. At 67, the left wall flared into a panel, crowded with figures so shallow they could have been shadows of carvings instead of the thing itself. He recognized nothing certain. He read heads that were not quite animals, not quite men. There, mouths slit like fish gills, their arms bent at angles his own could not bend. Between them, a line of dots ran from the upper left to the lower right like a trail of spilled meal. He set the lantern close and squinted. Some of the dots were not dots. They were small depressions, each the size of a pea, and when the lamplight trembled, each depression glimmered faint, as if something crystalline slept in them. Old Spanish? He whispered, and the stone returned his sibilant sh 3 times. Drying it to a hiss dot at 90, the lantern guttered and smoked. Elias lifted it, checked the wick, breathed on it as if on a fretful child. The tiny flame shrank to a curl, flared, and then steadied. The hand on the wall never left, not for that, not for the itch that ran under his collar, not for the nagging need to scratch at a mosquito bite under his knee. A man can promise himself small rules and live by them. It is one way to keep fear from growing taller than you are. When he heard his name, he stopped without choosing to dot, came on a tide of whispering the way a single clear bell will ride above rain. The voices were many and layered and distant, but his name, threaded through them in the tone Ruth used when she called him in from the yard, even in the exact rhythm of the syllables the blacksmith had laughed at yesterday. Elias. 2 plucked strings. The hair on his forearms rose. The chalk in his pocket felt suddenly heavy enough to drag his pants down. He raised the lantern, turned a fraction, hunting for a face that could fit that voice, and saw only the tight throat of the stairway and the polished slide of stone. Wind could do such a thing, he told himself. Wind and nerves and the memory of home. To prove it, he said aloud, "Who's there?" and heard the question spiral down and unspool in soft echoes that made him feel foolish. He went on. One tread, then another. At 109, the stair ended. The wall fell away into space, and the sound changed. He had the sense of a large room without seeing it, the way a blindfold will tell you when you step from hallway to barn. The lantern's circle opened over black floor and was swallowed. Elias crouched, put the light close to the lip of the vault. Last tread, and saw the drop was no more than a yard, down to a floor of the same dressed stone. He swung his legs, felt for purchase with his heel, found it, and eased down. His thighs singing with the strain dot, he walked the lantern forward 2 paces, and found water dot. It lay in a shallow basin, no, wider than a wagon's length across. The basin's lip had been masonry once. He could see the line of the joints even now, though mineral growth had furred them into a natural brim. The water was ink dark at the center, lighter where it came thin in the shallows. A glint moved there, then another, as if small things lived under the surface and were not asleep. The air came off that pool with a coolness that made the back of his throat ache with want. He found he had crouched, that his hand reached on its own for the brim. He stopped it and sat back on his heels instead, between the last step and the sille. Basin ran a ring of stones, low and slightly taller than a man's knee at their highest points, arranged in an asymmetry that his eye kept trying to correct. The ring had apertures gaps wide enough for 2 boots if a man stepped carefully placed without any pattern he could trust. Each stone, like the ones in the stair wall, carried markings, spirals, broken zigzags, clusters of those tiny depressions. In the cracks between certain stones, the faintest light pulsed, like a coal buried too deep in ash to show red, but too stubborn to go entirely black. He leaned until his cheek nearly brushed the stone and peered into one crack. The glow may as well have been imagined. He could not swear to it at this distance, and yet he knew in the way a man knows when a horse is about to shy that he had not brought that light here with his lamp. Fungus, he said softly, have to make it nothing, like rot on a cotton bale. Beyond the pool, the room stretched farther than the lantern could show. Once, twice, he thought he made out a hint of architecture, 2 pillars, or shadows where pillars might be. Then the darkness ate them again. The ceiling stayed low enough to count as a room rather than a cavern. Drops formed and let go and struck the water with small, precise sounds like nails set by a careful hand. The hush rose up from beneath the floor, or up his arm from the stone rings, or perhaps from the water itself. He edged along the ring until he found an opening that did not make his knees feel cleverer than they were, and stepped through into the sacred circle the stones had claimed for themselves. He hated the word sacred, hated that it had come to him, but it was the word he had. He set the lantern on the floor, and it gave back a weak shiver of himself. He reached to the basin, dipped his fingers in, and brought them to his lips before a second thought could catch them. Cool. Not flat like the end of the barrel rainwater they'd been hoarding, not brackish like the low draws. Sweet with minerals that made the sides of his tongue wake up. He took his hat off, held it as if he meant to dip it, and then remembered. The cattle and Ruth and the ledgers thin as an old hymn book, and stopped. He did not know if the water here would kill a man, or make him stronger, or turn him into something he had not been yesterday. He slipped off his bandana instead, swirled. It threw and wrung a little onto his tongue, then onto his cheeks and neck. The relief was immediate and almost indecent. He exhaled so hard he might have laughed if the place had not been listening. He took the notebook from his pocket and made himself write a line of plain facts to anchor himself. August 18th morning. Spiral marks. Steps number 109. Basin 10. By 12 guess. Water sweet, not foul. He hesitated, then scrawled, light in cracks see again, and underlined it. The pencil point snapped. He didn't swear at it, didn't want to offer that up, and sharpened it with his knife, letting the curls drop right where they fell, when he lifted the lantern again and swung the light toward the far side of the room. He saw it, not quite a door, but a slab set into the wall with care, like the fitted stones above. It was tall as a tall man, and had no hinges he could see, nor any seam at top or sides, only the bottom where grit lay in a drift as if wind had once played there. The slab carried the same markings as the ring stones, but all converged toward a center whirl dense enough to make his eyes water if he stared. The hairs on his neck stirred and then lay down again. He found himself raising the lantern, as if that would change what it was. The hush grew a body then. The layered whispers parted like a seine through minnows and one voice low, unhurried, so close he could have believed it was standing off his left shoulder, said his name again. Elias. He jerked so hard, the lantern hit his thigh and chimed. In its wire frame. Who's there? He said again, but the question was smaller now, stripped of its arrogance. I mean no harm, he added, and bit the inside of his cheek, because you didn't say soft things in tight places, unless you had made a friend of fear. Doubt something moved under the water. Not a fish, not a snake. It was the movement of something far down that turns over in sleep and in turning shifts the surface without breaking it. He stared until his eyes watered and saw nothing more. He had the stupid urge to touch the slab. He tamped it down. Instead, he stepped backward out of the ring, careful to place his feet where they had already been, picked up the lantern, and went to the bottom step. He took the chalk from his pocket and drew a hash mark across the tread. He stood a moment, considering, then turned back round and stooped and filled his small tally flask at the basin, stoppered it, and slid it into his pocket. When he straightened, the whispering swelled not in anger, but in attention, and he had the sense, absurd and enormous, that whatever had been speaking had not minded the theft and had possibly, impossibly, been waiting for it. A drip fell from the ceiling onto the back of his hand. He started like a gun had gone off, and then laughed once, a short cough of sound that made his ribs feel strange. On the way up he counted again, the chalk marks guiding his fingers, the twine paying out, and then, hearteningly, coming home. Twice. He stopped and snuffed the lantern with his fingers cupped around the chimney, listening. Twice he relit it and felt foolish. He could not tell if the voices followed or rode ahead of him, or if they only lived down there where the light could not quite find its reach out at the breach. He turned sideways and wriggled through, scraped his shoulder, tasted lime on his teeth. He climbed the boards like a boy up a hayloft, and when the sky opened over him, white hot already, though the sun still rode, the east, he blinked like a mole and stood with his hands on his knees, breathing the dry air like a luxury. Ruth had swept the yard. Lines lay in the dust like scripture. She came to the well at a walk that was neither slow nor fast, her face composed around its questions. He had already decided what he would say and what he would keep. Well, she asked, and then, with the humor she used to buy herself time, bad choice of words. There's space under, he said, honest as far as it went. Cut stone, steps, old, cooler than you'd think. And water? He put his hand in his pocket and touched the small flask. Maybe, he said. I'm not sure yet. She studied him the way she studied the sky when she was trying to read rain out of nothing. Your cuffs are wet. Condensation, he said, too quickly, and looked away. Her hand came up and then fell without touching his sleeve. They stood like that a moment, so close they could have shared a breath, and each pretending not to notice the others. "I'll make noon biscuits," she said finally, and this time there was no humor in it, only the steadiness that kept a roof on a house when men were making holes in the ground. After she left, he sank to a squat and watched the dark in the shaft as if it might boil. The sound from below did not come up in daylight, or if it did, the cicadas erased it. He pulled the cross the boy had sold him off the nail, where he'd hung it, and slipped it into his pocket with the flask, then thought better of it and put the metal back on the nail. Superstition is like that. You argue with it, and then take its advice. The day went its way, mending wire, turning the compost that wasn't compost, checking the cattle for pink eye. He did each thing with an attention, so exact it had to be a form of escape. At noon he drank coffee and did not taste it. At 1 he laid under the wagon, where the shade was a few degrees kinder, and listened to the boards tick. Twice he put his hand on the flask and then took it away. He told himself he should have it tested, as if there were any test to be had besides drinking and waiting to see. If the belly turned dot at dusk, he went back with a bucket and rope under the pretense of shoring. More, and was proud of himself that he did not descend. He lowered the bucket through the breach and tapped it against the bottom step until he felt where it would swing free, then drew it up empty again and scolded himself for what he had just tried without admitting that he had tried it. He slept in a tumble that felt like falling down an endless set of steps, and woke in the gray and listened for what he had been afraid to hear and heard. Only the night go breathless and then start up again as a bird made the first dumb sound of morning. He watched Ruth sleep with her hand open on the blanket, as if she had been holding something and it had leaked away. He thought of the slab and the whirl in its center, and in the space between sleeping and waking, he saw not a door but a pupil. And the shiver that took him did not completely let go even when he stood and set his boots on. He rose, dressed, and lit the lantern. He took a coil of thinner line, a small hook, and a bucket with a lip he bent in a spout with a hammer. He had the flask in his pocket still, and did not acknowledge it. He told himself he would go only as far as the bottom of the steps and look. He told himself he would not step into the ring. He told himself he would say nothing if the voice said his name, and that he would not answer to Elias. As if it had the right to it. In the yard, the cattle raised their heads and looked toward the mesa, and then away again. A wind came off. The flat that had to have come from nowhere, because there was no place for it to gather, and still it found them. The mouth of the shaft waited with its cool exhale. He set the boards aside and tied the line for the bucket and fixed the rope at his waist and looked into the dark and saw his own face small and wavering there like the lantern's ghost. Later, he told the day, which was only half awake. Later and careful. He set his hand to the wall and went down. The flask weighed heavier in Elias's pocket with every passing day, as if the water inside it grew denser the longer it stayed corked. He carried it when he rode fence, when he checked the herd, even when he sat at the table with Ruth. He never offered her a sip, nor did she ask, though she'd noticed the bulge and the way his hand strayed to it. A wife knows a man's secrets even when he refuses to name them. 3 mornings after he first filled it, Elias gave in. He had been mending wire near the south pasture, the sun hammering his neck, when thirst overcame caution. He pulled the flask, uncorked it, and let the liquid burn its cold trail down his throat. It was water, yes, sweet, clear, but also more than water. He felt it spread through him like fire through sagebrush, igniting his muscles, sharpening his eyes. The ache in his shoulders from the spade, the slow throb in his knees from years of ranch work gone, as if someone had drawn them out with a needle. When he returned to the corral that evening, Ruth looked at him as though he'd been touched by the rain she prayed for every night. His skin had color again, His step had a lightness she hadn't seen since Missouri. But she also caught a restlessness, something fierce in his eyes that did not belong to the man she had married. That night, the voices came stronger. He lay in bed beside Ruth, staring at the low rafters, when the murmur welled up not from outside, not from the desert wind, but from inside the walls, inside the earth beneath their house. It was like a choir murmuring beneath the floorboards. He rose quietly, not to wake her, and stepped out into the yard. The well shaft yawned at him, a black mouth in the moonlight. He swore he saw the boards shift as though breathing. The whispers beckoned, weaving together, phrases nearly shaping into sense. He went closer until the draft stroked his face and the voices overlapped into something plain. Open. Open the gate. He stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. The whispering did not follow, but lingered, like the ringing after a bell. He told himself he had dreamed it, yet the dirt on his bare feet the next morning said otherwise. The promise of plenty, Elias began drawing buckets from the basin in secret. By day he dug the shaft wider, reinforcing the boards so he could lower himself easily. By night he carried pails back to the surface and poured them into the cattle trough. At first he worried they'd sicken, but they drank greedily, and within days their hides shone, their ribs softened under fresh flesh. Calves too weak to stand began tottering on legs that no longer trembled. The land itself seemed to answer. A faint green tint crept over patches where he poured water, the sage brightening, the dust dampening enough to hold the shape of his boot. The Boone Ranch stood in contrast to the neighbors, where cattle dropped in the heat and men spoke of abandoning the valley. Elias's spread looked like a small miracle. Word traveled quick in Dry Creek. Neighbors rode by, offering thin excuses to borrow tools or trade for flour, their eyes straying to his herd, his well-fed horses. Silas McGraw, who'd sworn he was pulling stakes, lingered in town to see what the Boone place had conjured. The sheriff rode out one afternoon, hat in hand. Strange thing, he said, spitting dust. Dry as bones for 10 miles, yet your stock looks fit as spring calves. You dig a new well? Elias gave a half-smile. Lucky strike, that's all. The sheriff scratched his chin. Lucky, sure. Just don't keep it secret too long. Folks get suspicious. Suspicion brings trouble. When the lawman left, Elias went straight to the shaft. He set his hand on the fitted stones, pressing as if to reassure himself they were real. The voices rose with his touch, a susurrus of need, of bargain. They wanted something for what they'd given him. That night, he dreamed of the cavern. He saw the ring of stones, the basin, and beyond it, the tall slab in the wall with its spirals, twisting inward like an eye. In the dream, the slab shifted, cracked slightly, and from behind it spilled not light, but sound roar of voices, jubilant and terrifying, like thousands greeting him. He woke to Ruth shaking him, whispering his name in fright. His skin was clammy, his body cold, though the night was sweltering. What is it, Elias? What's got you? He held her close, unwilling to answer. He knew what had him. The gate. Ruth's fears. Ruth Boone had long been a woman of quiet faith. She had endured drought, miscarriage, the ache of leaving her people back east all without complaint. But she was not blind. She saw the glow that clung to Elias's skin after he returned from the shaft, the restless pacing of his nights, the way his eyes darted to the well even when he sat with her at supper. One evening she followed him. He slipped from bed at midnight, lantern in hand, moving with the careful steps of a thief. Ruth wrapped herself in her shawl and crept behind him, heart drumming. From behind the corral fence she watched him descend into the earth. A long while later he came back, hauling a sloshing bucket. She saw, even in the faint light, how it shimmered faintly, as if the water itself carried a glow. He poured it into the trough, stroked the flank of a cow that drank, and whispered something under his breath. Not prayer petition. She could not hear the words, but the way his shoulders bent was enough. She returned to bed before him, heart tight. When he lay down, she turned away, afraid to let him see her face. The next morning she spoke. "Elias, you ought not use what you don't understand. It's not natural." "Water's water," he said. "Too quick. It's more than water." Her eyes held his. "I feel it. The cattle feel it. And you look at me like you're somewhere else entirely. What's down there?" He hesitated. For the first time since he found the stair, he wanted to tell her everything. The carvings, the whispering, the slab waiting like a door in the dark. But to speak it aloud would be to bind himself, and he wasn't ready. "There's a spring," he said. "That's all. A spring." Ruth's jaw set. "God help us, Elias, it ain't right." "I can hear it, too. At night. Voices. They call out. I won't set foot near that well." Her words rattled him. He had thought himself alone in hearing them. If Ruth too heard the whispers, then they were no dream, no madness. They were real, and they wanted something more. The bargain 2 nights. Later, the voices sharpened. He lay awake. Ruth turned away from him when the whispers rose clear, echoing from the shaft, though the boards were laid firm. "Elias Boone," they said, speaking his full name for the first time. "The land is yours. The rain will be yours. The herds will grow, but you must open the gate." He sat up, trembling, sweat running cold. The slab filled his mind's eye, that spiral world dense as a storm. He could see his hand upon it, pushing, and the flood of voices rushing out to greet him. "Open the gate," they whispered again, in a chorus that seemed to come from the very beams of the house. Ruth stirred, mumbling in her sleep, her hand brushing his arm. He nearly broke, then nearly told her, nearly begged her to save him from his own desire. But pride and fear kept his mouth shut. He rose, took the lantern, and walked once more toward the well. The boards lay easy beneath his hands, as though they'd shifted aside themselves. The draught lifted his hair, cool as river water. He descended into the dark, and the voices followed him down. Elias Boone did not sleep the night he chose. He lay in bed with Ruth's back warm against him, her breath steady, her hand resting on her belly as though holding something unseen. Outside, the cattle shifted in their pens, tails whisking at flies. The desert lay silent, except for the breath of wind moving down from the mesa. But beneath all that quiet, he heard the call, patient, layered, coaxing. "Elias Boone, open." By dawn his decision was set. He rose, pulled on his boots, and kissed Ruth's temple without waking her. He took the lantern, 2 fresh flasks, his colt, and a crowbar. When he crossed the yard, the sky was pale and bruised with the promise of heat. The well shaft exhaled its cool breath, as though waiting. Down he went, past the fitted stones, past the carved spirals, past the landing where niches stared at him like hollow eyes, past the steps marked with chalk, each one counting his trespass, and at last into the cavern, where the basin gleamed black and the ring of stones pulsed with faint emberlight. The slab waded across the water, tall and silent, its spirals pulling his gaze into their world. This time he did not hesitate. 2. The bargain made, he waded the shallows, water soaking his boots, cold as melted snow. The voices grew louder with every step. Though not in his ears, they spoke in his chest, his bones, his blood. "Elias, you are chosen. You have drunk. You have seen. Now give, and you shall be given." He reached the slab and set his palm against its surface. It was warm, almost fevered, as if something inside pressed back. The spiral whirl seemed to turn beneath his skin. His hand shook but did not draw away. "What do you want?" He whispered. The answer came clear, many voices woven as one, to return. The spiral brightened faintly. The slab pulsed under his palm like a beating heart. His thoughts whirled. Return? To where? To what? But with the question came promise. He saw in his mind's eye grass thick as spring velvet rolling across the young. Mesa, rivers running clear, cattle fattened and uncountable. He saw himself a baron of Dry Creek, envied by all, feared by none. And over it all, a single demand. Open the gate. He braced the crowbar, wedging it into the seam at the slab's base. Stone grated. A low moan rolled through the chamber. Not of resistance, but of welcome. The basin quivered, its surface shivering, though no drop fell. Elias strained, sweat pouring, until the slab shifted a hand's width. A rush of air burst forth cold, damp, and filled with voices screaming, not in anger but in ecstasy. Thousands layered into one long, rising cry. The cavern shook, dust raining. Down, the embers in the ring flared bright. And something moved in the dark behind the slab. Pressing forward, Elias staggered back, the crowbar clanging to the stone floor. His lantern flickered, nearly went out. He glimpsed a shape through the widening crack, vast, coiled, glistening like wet stone, eyes that glowed with a light not of this world. The voices screamed again, now jubilant, now desperate. And then, above it all, Ruth's voice. Elias! 3. Ruth's defiant she had followed him. She had woken to the emptiness of their bed, seen the boards aside at the well, and known where he had gone. In her nightdress, hair unbound, she climbed down the shaft, her bare feet bleeding against stone, clutching nothing but the small silver cross the boy had sold Elias in town. She burst into the cavern just as the slab cracked wider, the spiral glowing like a brand. The wind from the gate whipped her hair, tugged at her gown, chilled her to the bone. She saw Elias, lantern in hand, eyes wide with awe and terror. "Don't!" she cried. "For God's sake, Elias, don't!" The voices turned at her. "Thee!" Whispers swelled, sneering, coaxing, begging. Another. Ruth staggered toward the ring of stones. The glow brightened as she stepped inside, as though recognizing her presence. She held the cross high, her hand trembling but unyielding. "In Christ's name," she said, her voice breaking but strong enough to carry. "You'll not have him. You'll not have us." The cavern shuddered. The chorus of voices faltered, breaking into a shriek of rage and hunger. Elias dropped to his knees, clutching his head, the sound tearing through him like claws. The slab convulsed, the crack snapping shut with a thunderous clap that shook the cavern. The basin boiled, sending spray into the air. The ember glow in. The ring of stones flared, once then died, leaving only darkness, not IV. The vanishing when Elias opened his eyes. He lay on the cavern floor. The lantern had gone out. The hush was gone too. The only sound was dripping water. He rose shakily, calling Ruth's name, but she was not there. Not the ring of stones stood cold and dark. The slab loomed silent, whole again, its spirals dull. The basin rippled faintly, as though something had just slipped beneath. Of Ruth there was no trace, no cross, no footprints, no voice. Only absence. He staggered back up the stair, up through the breach, up the shaft into the scorching morning light. The yard was empty, the house still. He called for her until his throat tore, but only the cattle answered, lowing nervously. The days that followed blurred. Neighbors came, drawn by rumors of green shoots at the Boone place, of cattle fattening when all others withered. They found no sign of Ruth. Elias told them she had gone east, back to family. Some believed, others whispered, but none stayed long, for the well gave off a chill that raised their hackles, and at night, from the mesa, came faint cries that sounded too much like human voices. Soon after, Elias Boone, too, was gone. The ranch stood empty, the cattle wandering until the herd broke and vanished into the desert. Travelers swore the well still breathed, cool and damp, and that if you leaned close, you could hear voices rising, calling names you did not want. To hear Dot, and when the wind combed the mesa, it sometimes carried a woman's voice, soft and steady, as if praying still.